Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Joining me today is Dan Wren, the National Director of Government Affairs in the D.C. office, and Craig Leshak, a Director of Conservation Programs here in Memphis. Today we're going to talk about NAWCA. And NAWCA, we'll just go ahead and add this up to our alphabet soup of information. It is the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. But first, let's get started with Dan. And Dan, can you go ahead and introduce yourself, kind of tell people what you do and what the D.C. office does?
DU has an office pretty much located on Capitol Hill. We're right across the street, actually from the Capitol. And DU is one of the first conservation organizations actually that really had a strong presence in Washington, D.C. DU leaders early on realized that federal policy was going to be very critical to the long-term conservation of the necessary wetlands and uplands and associated habitats to sustain ducks and duck hunting. So my primary responsibility is to monitor and affect public policies and federal policies that impact how the government partners with groups like DU to make sure that we have sufficient habitat to maintain populations of waterfowl, for the next generation. Our office right now, there are 4 full-time staff, and we're a pretty tight group, and we do a lot of communicating with members of Congress, with the administration, always making sure that we let them know that there is a very organized, passionate, vocal group of conservationists behind us, and that's who gives us our basic marching orders on what we do in Washington, D.C.
Very cool. Thanks, Dan. That was a really good overview, and that's one thing that we talk about a lot is our policy work, that things can change as far as conservation and hunting basically with the stroke of a pen, and having you guys out there to monitor that, stay abreast of all these situations is fantastic. We'll move on into NAWCA because NAWCA really falls into that policy world, and I'm sure you guys are very aware and very in tune with everything, but we've got Craig on here. Craig Leshak is going to explain what NAWCA is and what NAWCA does and how DU is involved with the North American Wetlands Conservation Act.
NAWCA, or as North American Wetlands Conservation Act, was enacted in 1989. Its main purpose back then was in support to provide a funding mechanism for the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. That plan was signed by the U.S. and Canada and Mexico, and basically it outlined population objectives and habitat objectives for waterfowl, but it did not have any funding behind the plan.
Which is important.
Exactly. In order to put habitat on the ground, you had NAWCA implemented in 1989, and it was the funding mechanism in order to put waterfowl habitat on the ground. Fast forward 30 years, that has evolved over time, and NAWCA now is focused beyond waterfowl. Waterfowl is still an important component, but it looks at all migratory birds now. And that sort of goes hand in hand with the work that Ducks Unlimited does, is it benefits far more than just ducks. We may focus on it from a waterfowl species, and it's important, but as I always say, there's no signs on these projects that say, no other birds allowed except ducks, and certainly a lot of projects, they may only be used seasonally with waterfowl, and yet still year-round they provide important habitat for 900 plus species of wildlife, including many hundreds of migratory bird species. So
no, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely correct. And another thing that we stress is this benefits everyone. Dan, one thing, he mentioned the 1989, and you and I have talked off the podcast many times about the fact that you were kind of on the ground, at ground level in the policy world when NAWCA came through. Can you kind of explain how that whole, the history of NAWCA from a policy perspective?
Sure, Chris. I'm kind of dating myself now because that puts me back. Let's see, it would have been the summer of my junior year in college. I came down to D.C. from Connecticut for a summer internship.
Did you ride a horse and buggy, or?
No, we walked. They hadn't invented the wheel yet. So I came down for that summer, and it was just such an eye-opening experience. I grew up hunting and fishing back home, but never really, understood how groups like DU, Pheasants Forever, National Wild Turkey Federation, all of these groups were just sort of on the front end, and DU actually had at that point started to build a small professional office in DC, and really started to understand that hunting and fishing and the habitat necessary to carry it out, it's a lot of effort. It's a lot of work. And so going back to, say, 93, 94, I don't have my spreadsheets in front of me, but you're looking at us, DU, our volunteers, our members, going up to Capitol Hill and encouraging members of Congress to support funding NAWCA back then at probably, I would say, $3.5 million, $5 million, somewhere in that range, which back then, that was a lot of money, because one of the key features of NAWCA is that it requires the federal money to be matched. And so you have this program that if we get appropriated $5 million, that's not all the money that's going to impact projects for that year. It's going to be tripled. Typically, that's a 3-to-1 match is what we get. Fast forward to now, so back then it was $5 million a year. Fast forward to now, and we're hovering in the low 42 to $44 million a year. That number's gone up and down a little bit, but when you look at the impact of that over the last 30 years, you're looking at close to 30 million acres of migratory bird, waterfowl habitat on the ground, which is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you kind of hit it on, this matching and how, the federal money has to be matched. And Craig, can you kind of elaborate on that elaborate on how the NAWCA grant process works?
Sure.
We've got Dan talking about, hey, and even last week or a couple weeks ago, we had, a call to action to contact your congressman to pass NAWCA. So we've seen the policy side, but from your perspective, let's kind of discuss how NAWCA goes from policy to getting a check to habitat on the ground.
Well, and I can reflect on, I've been involved with NAWCA for the past 25 years, so almost all of its existence professionally, having managed waterfowl habitat on the ground that was paid for with NAWCA dollars, to writing NAWCA grants, with Ducks Unlimited, to implementing habitat on the ground paid with NAWCA, to now, my role as a Ducks Unlimited representative on the NAWCA Council as a staff person that scores and ranks these NAWCA proposals. So I've sort of run the whole gamut with the program, but it all is rooted in partnerships. And Dan mentioned the match, that it requires a minimum of 1-to-1 match. So for every dollar you ask for from the federal government, you have to provide at least $1 of non-federal origin.
Yeah, and those can come from any source
other than the federal government,
okay.
Right? And that's the minimum, but your score goes up as you give more, up into 2-to-1. So you get maximum points for giving at least $2 of non-federal match for $1 of NAWCA money. And
that's what makes the partner so important. And so this money's coming from partners, private donors,
Absolutely.
And then even DU money,
state
okay.
agencies, and the whole NAWCA process focuses on the importance of the biology when you're scoring them, and the partnership aspect of it. That's a key component. And not only the match that you're bringing, but how many total partners you have involved. What are the origin of those partnerships? Are they state, federal, private, corporate? You get points for all sorts of different partnership categories. So, and how you're leveraging those dollars is very important. And so it's not just based solely on, hey, is this good waterfowl habitat? Mm-hmm. It's based on how important it is to the ducks, but also how many partners are you bringing to the table? And that's an important part for Ducks Unlimited. As someone that is the grantee on a lot of NAWCA grants, yet we don't do it alone because we don't have enough resources, and if you're a single partner, you don't get as many points.
Yeah.
So we have to work with all these other entities to put the habitat on the ground, and it's an incredible process of building those. I've been on many an end trying to build a NAWCA proposal, and you have to go out and you have to pull your partners together and say, okay, let's focus. Where are some key wetland restoration projects needed? What about match? Who has money to or other projects to contribute to this that we can use as match? And then let's get this proposal together. And then once we get the dollars, well, we got to go out on the ground and build it and put the money on the ground and get all the partners involved in that. And then when it's all wrapped up, we can celebrate another successful, NAWCA grant. And we do this over and over again. And partners come to us because they trust us that we're able to leverage their dollars with NAWCA dollars in the best way possible, and that the habitat we put on the ground is, second to none.
Yeah. Who are some of these partners that you're working with?
So a lot of times we work with state agencies, so all the state fish and wildlife agencies, depending on what state you're in, what it may be, but they are a key partner. We work with other conservation groups like National Wild Turkey Federation, Pheasants Forever, California Waterfowl Association. We run the gamut on other NGOs that we work with. And then private landowners. We work a lot with private landowners where, the private landowners have skin in the game because they're giving match in order to get those dollars to put programs on their property. We
Absolutely.
have one example is in Texas. We have the Texas Prairie Wetlands Project, where we cost share habitat conservation with private landowners. And on average, they put in 35 to 40% of the total costs of a project are out of the landowner's pocket.
Wow, that's
and
impressive.
Ducks Unlimited and its partners through NAWCA grants and other sources put in the other 65%. But they have skin in the game for sure.
Absolutely. And talking about skin in the game, Dan kind of alluded to this briefly, but talking about Ducks Unlimited members, supporters, going up to DC and meeting with their elected officials. And Dan, can you kind of walk the audience through, because they may be unaware of the fact that we do these DC fly-ins where we bring our members to DC to their senator's office or their congressman and walk them through and let them meet their elected officials and sit down and discuss not only NAWCA but several other policy issues and kind of walk the audience through that process of how you guys facilitate these DC fly-ins.
Sure. So one of the best ways to impact the decisions that your member of Congress or senator are going to make on things like NAWCA funding or Farm Bill conservation programs is to actually take time out of your busy schedule. And we know from DU volunteers they do that a lot. But every year we do call on some of our volunteers, state chairs, state policy chairs, to come to DC and spend 2 to 3 days with the policy staff, and we go up and we meet with your senators and your representatives face to face, and really explain to them the importance of not just NAWCA and NAWCA funding, but how important DU is to them personally, what DU means. And it when people see the passion that DU volunteers have when they talk about DU, as a member of Congress or a staffer, you're going to see that and you're going to want to be part of that. Even if you've never pulled the trigger in a marsh, even if you didn't grow up hunting or fishing, you see that passion and that dedication that these folks have, and it really helps to promote those conservation values that we sometimes take for granted, but we certainly are devoted to. And so, if folks are interested in coming to DC, we'd love to have them. We routinely have at least one fly-in a year. But, you don't have to come to DC to do this. That's the other important point to make. You can do it back in your home states, and you can visit your members of Congress and your senators when they're back home, on congressional recesses from DC. There are a lot of ways to impact the decisions that they're going to make that will have a direct impact on wetland and waterfowl resources.
Each year, DU volunteers and staff hold more than 4,000 fundraising events across the country. By simply attending a local Ducks Unlimited event, you can have a great time while helping DU fill the sky with waterfowl for future generations. To find an event in your area, visit www.ducks.org/events.
It's December 5th. NAWCA has passed the House. What is the kind of call to action right now for DU members if they want to pick up the phone and call their elected official regarding NAWCA? What are you explaining to our supporters to kind of reach out to their elected officials about and in which manner?
So as most folks are abundantly aware, the state of politics is a little chaotic and mercurial. And what we try and do is cut through the politics of all that and continue to advocate on behalf of the programs and the policies that are best for waterfowl, ducks, and duck hunting. Right now, we've actually got some good momentum going. 2 weeks ago, the House of Representatives passed our NAWCA reauthorization bill. We were very excited about that. It really got a good, strong, bipartisan support. And so now we are turned towards the Senate, and we have a great bill right now, S-261. It is the companion legislation that they just passed in the House. So it's the same bill, only introduced on the Senate side. We've already got 40 bipartisan co-sponsors on it in the Senate. So we're almost at it. When you get a bill and you get 50 or more co-sponsors on it, you're getting really close to getting the attention of Senate leadership, and folks start to look at it and go, wait, why am I not on that bill? If it can get 50 co-sponsors, I think I want to be a part of it.
Who are some of the key players in that, Dan?
It's hard to say. At different times, different members of Congress are the key player. I would say right now, one of the key players in the Senate would be Senator Barrasso from Wyoming. He is the chair of the committee that NAWCA is going to have to go through. And so a lot of the decisions on how it will play out in the Senate will go through, his staff and how they handle it. Obviously, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who we were just had a dedication for a new National Wildlife Refuge in Kentucky. He's a TU supporter. He knows us well, as does Senator Barrasso. Senator Thune from South Dakota is part of the leadership. He's a huge DU supporter. Has done yeoman's work on conservation, especially as it relates to agriculture. So we've got a lot of key allies over there. And, if I were to, the first thing to say is that thank you to all the members of DU and volunteers who donate their time and treasure to our events and to their committees. You're already supporting our work here in Washington, D.C. And oftentimes that doesn't get said enough and clearly enough. You're already supporting us. Thank you so much. And these successes that we have with NAWCA, 30 million acres on the ground, you're already part of that. If I were to ask for a little bit more, another 5 minutes, I'd say go on our website and look and see if your United States Senator has already co-sponsored S-261 in the Senate.
And we have that list. We have that list available at ducks.org/NAWCA. So yeah, that's what Dan's referencing there. You can look and see which one of your elected officials is actively engaged.
And if you notice that your senator is not on there, you can click another button and it will take you to a page that will let you communicate directly with that senator's office. It's very simple. The message is, as a Ducks Unlimited member, I want you to support S-261. It's good for our state. It's good for our economy. It's good for our country. Those are the kind of messages that need to be delivered. Back when I was a younger buck doing this stuff, we used to write out 4, 5, 6 paragraphs. That's not the way we do it anymore. It's short and succinct. And if folks get tangled up in any of this, you can call our office in D.C., 202-347-1530, and we will, help any way we can to get you to make that communication. One of the things that it's important to highlight here is, despite what you see in the press and see in the media, the vast majority of members of Congress and senators, they want to do what's good and what their constituents want them to do. So you're actually helping them by telling them, hey, I like this. I want you to support this too. And it creates a good relationship between DU and that office that carries on into the future. Most of our biggest supporters that we work with on Capitol Hill are members of Congress or senators that we've worked with for decades. They know DU. They like how we work. They like how we operate. And so your ability back home to make that connection allows us to magnify your voice here in D.C. and make sure all those investments and policies that are good for ducks and duck hunting stay in place.
Thanks, Dan. Craig, one quick question. Yeah. As Dan was kind of talking, I was thinking, we've talked about partnering with state agencies, and we have lists of, state-by-state breakdowns of NAWCA grants that people can go and look at, also at ducks.org/NAWCA. But how does DU facilitate NAWCA grants internationally?
Yeah.
Like, how does that work?
And that's the important point. When you know NAWCA, the first two words are North American.
That's right.
And so the dollars don't just stay in the U.S. They are allocated to Canada and Mexico. And, the reason is obvious: migratory birds. They breed in Canada, they make their way through the United States, and some continue on down into Mexico for the wintering period. And so it's important that we put habitat in all 3 continents for birds to ensure that they have sufficient, feeding areas and resting areas and breeding areas throughout their whole life cycle. And so Ducks Unlimited actually works with state agencies to send money up to Canada to be used as match on NAWCA grants that go to for work in Canada, and a lot of those go to Ducks Unlimited Canada. Mm-hmm. And so we're able to take a state contribution that comes to us, we match it dollar for dollar, and we send that money up to Canada, and they use that money as non-federal match for NAWCA grants that they put together. So it's quite it's really a neat mechanism we have in place, and the states are the ones who developed this program because they realize the importance of where their birds come from. Mm-hmm. And as a result, and the need for non-federal match in NAWCA, and the fact that obviously Canada has a smaller population of people and less ability from a support, and yet waterfowl hunters here in the U.S. benefit from the habitat work that is done in Canada.
Absolutely.
And every U.S. hunter benefits from the NAWCA work throughout Canada. And so the dollars that state agencies send and we match and send up there are, so critical to the habitat work that we do in Canada.
Very cool.
And so that's a great example of the North American component of the North American Wetlands Conservation Act.
Absolutely. That's great. And I think we just crossed off yet another acronym that we all so freely discuss and kind of crossed it off to explain to our audience the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. We could do probably 10 more podcasts on these.
Sure.
Dan, we could probably do 10 more with you. But this one's very cool just with the fact that, people are getting to hear both sides of this. You hear the on-the-ground side, how NAWCA is implemented, but you're also hearing from Dan in the D.C. office, and they're explaining the importance of, getting this off the ground. I mean, again, I'll reiterate, just a simple stroke of the pen from the policy side, and this could go away, or it could double.
That's right.
You know, and so that's what we try and stress to people. And Dan, appreciate your efforts out there for sure. And thanks for joining us today. We'll probably have you back on here sometime very soon.
My pleasure.
I'd like to give a thanks to our National Director of Government Affairs, Dan Wren, for joining us and bringing everyone up to speed on Ducks Unlimited's policy efforts and the D.C. office. I'd also like to thank our Director of Conservation Operations here in Memphis, Craig Lashak. The show offered great examples of how DU's policy work in D.C. and in the regions leads directly to habitat on the ground for waterfowl and other wildlife. For all of our motivated listeners out there who want to learn more about the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, or NAWCA, NAWCA, visit ducks.org/NAWCA. Thanks to all of you for listening to the Ducks Unlimited podcast and for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.